Thank you so much, Jane. So it's now my pleasure to introduce Karen Peters. Karen is a registered clinical counselor who supports parents and kids through counseling services and online education in her private practice. She has 20 years of experience working with the Ministry for Children and Family Development and is passionate about supporting families through difficult circumstances and challenging transitions. She honors people's lived experiences and seeks to remove shame from the equation, making room for real growth and progress. She's going to share some strategies with us today on boundary building in relationships with adult children and extended family. So, Karen, it's over to you.
Thank you so much. Before I get going, I will let you know that I am coming from my office in Fort Langley, BC, which is on the unceded territory of the Kwantlen, Katzie, Matsqui, and Samiamu First Nations. And it's such an honor to work in this beautiful, beautiful space. So that's where I'm coming from today. And as Sandi had recognized there, that the bulk of my experience actually has been in facilitating management work in the ministry, province-wide. It was around 10 years of it was around continuous quality improvement, which was really aimed at listening to the voice of people on the front line and people who were receiving services through child and youth mental health. And I was responding to situations where kids had been at risk and change needed to happen in our system to better suit their needs. So that was about half my work with the ministry. The other half of it was in direct clinical space with families, supporting all sorts of families of every makeup, in the Fraser Valley region. So the common component of the families that I worked with was that there was a child who had a diagnosed mental health concern. And so I worked with all sorts of family members and supports to try and help navigate that and meet the child's mental health needs the best we could. So I left that position about 2 or 3 years ago to work more in private practice. So I am now full-time in private practice, and my work spans from meeting directly with kids, with young kids. I do some play therapy, and all the way up to couples counseling, supporting whole family structures, and doing some complex need navigation with parents who are pulling their hair out for good reason. So I'm in that headspace much of the time. So I'll have to say, as a disclaimer, my voice is a little raspy today. Yesterday I did 3 back-to-back talks, and I don't think I've spoken. That half of my job should be listening, but I did a lot of talking yesterday, so I'm feeling it. I do have my coffee and my water on hand, but forgive that part of my voice today. So I'm going to share my screen to get going. I'm always uncertain about what you can see on your end when I do that, so let's see how this goes here. Okay, so I sent, there we go. Okay. All right, so our conversation today, I'm really looking forward to some rich dialogue afterwards. So I hope you feel like you're prepared to participate, because everyone's unique situations are coming to the table today. And I'm not interested in having all the answers, but I am interested in gleaning some wisdom from you about your own lived experience and how we can facilitate sharing that in a group. When that happens, I find that we learn tenfold. It's not just me yammering at you. So I'm going to give you some basic kind of introduction around what boundary building looks like. some acknowledgement around your lived experience in the broader picture of kinship care, what that looks like to be wearing multiple hats, and also some attention that we need to pay toward self-care. I can't remember the last time I did a talk that didn't include a slide about self-care. It matters in every aspect that we do. If we are depleted and run dry, it's really hard to utilize any skills that we've learned. So my information is useless to you if you're not in a good place to be able to kind of implement some things. So we'll talk about that as well. So I just want to start off by acknowledging the complex situation you are in. You have entered a very multitasking role, multi-role position, and you are so many things to so many people. That can't be summed up in a presentation. So I just want to name that I can put my finger on the fact that it's complicated, but I know that every single one of you have your own version of how confusing wearing multiple hats can be. So that's why I'm hoping the dialogue happens after the presentation. It's not just confusing for you when you wear more than one role, but it's also confusing for kids who frequently don't stay in one place for long, where rules change, roles change, boundaries change, and kids will be moved in and out of, not in and out of relationships so much as the type of relationship with you. And so because that shifts, it can be difficult and confusing for kids to know, who am I to you now? Who's the authority now? Who do I listen to today? And also for you to be able to adjust your realistic expectations of yourself and of other people. It's a big mental load to be shifting that storyline all the time. It's also a phenomenon where you have very little control when somebody else has stepped in to say what your role is. So just acknowledging from my experience in the ministry, supporting foster parents or supporting respite caregivers or family members who have stepped up for a temporary period of time when things were really difficult. And that has very much been portrayed to me as a feeling of I don't feel like I have a ton of say. It's really, I'm just following the lead of somebody else who is not in our family, but who's making some very important decisions about where our kids are and when, and what we are to do with them. I also want to acknowledge the impact that has on you just as a individual and a human being, and also in your other relationships, the time that you have available to nurture things like close friendships, which you so badly need when you're parenting, and your ability to recognize when you are overwhelmed and you have high stress going on, that you can expect some increased anxiety when you don't have a sense of feeling in control. And a common experience, which is so understandable, is how quickly multiple hats and lack of control can slip into a sense of resentment. Resentment doesn't classically have a very nice ring tone to it, right? So we don't like that term. It kind of has an ugly feel to it. It doesn't feel good to feel resentful, but I would say it is. There are circumstances that are ripe for resentment. That there's so many opportunities, and how easy it can be to slip into that headspace. And so, if you're feeling that way, I have great compassion for you. That is not the place you want to feel like you're in, particularly if it's toward people you love so dearly. And I also want to say that there's grief and loss that happens for each of you that is really hard to put a name to, because it's not as clean cut as losing someone in a final way to death. But you have a lot that in the backdrop of what you're trying to be present for when you're grandparenting and parenting is the loss of your own freedom, the ideas that you had for this phase of life, what it might mean for your couple relationship if you're in one, your grief and loss around your ability to prioritize yourself much of the time. And what we know about this stage of your own development is, and in our culture particularly, is what you have expected this to look like is probably not what this looks like for you. So I wanted to name that today because I think that's an important piece. I want to share a quote with you. And this quote in particular means something to me because I think it's a common experience that when we are the recipient of someone else drawing a line in the sand, it can very quickly feel as though we are being abandoned or rejected. It can feel like hurt. When someone close to us has a line that's different than ours, and maybe their bubble's a bit bigger than ours, or the line is drawn a bit firmer, it can feel like hurt. But I just want to set the stage for recognizing that when we are people who are the recipients of other people's boundaries, or we are the ones setting the boundaries, that our intention is around continuing relationship well, allowing space for that relationship to continue. It is not about intentionally harming someone. So when people set boundaries with you, it's their attempt to continue the relationship with you. It is not an attempt to hurt you. That's a quote by Elizabeth Earnshaw. So let's talk a little bit about understanding what boundaries are. Some of this might seem simplistic, but I'm amazed at, after 20 years of doing this, when I catch myself not holding very good space for myself in terms of clean boundaries, how I have to come back to the nuts and bolts and remind myself, okay, what is a boundary? What should it look like? What does it feel like when it's there? How do we hold these? What is it all about? Essentially, a boundary is about us declaring what is okay and not okay. And what's important about this is that your boundaries do not need to match the boundaries of another person. It is subjective. So it's what is okay and what is not okay for you. And that needs to resonate enough to give us permission to say, my boundaries are my boundaries. It is, I can declare what is okay and not okay for me, and that's fair. Something else that we know about healthy boundaries is that they require real clarity. Fuzzy boundaries are really difficult for people to not only acknowledge and detect, but also honor and respect. So being really clear about your own boundaries is very important. That clarity starts within you. It's not between you and somebody else. In order to communicate what your boundaries are, you really have to sit with yourself and think through what it means for you in clear terms, so that you know how to deliver that appropriately to the person you feel you need to have a boundary with. It also requires that communication. So it can be clear to you, but if you're not able to communicate that and address it with the person that it's required with, it falls flat. And that can be a recipe for resentment, because we place ourselves in a position where we expect people to read our minds. We think we're being clear, but we're not being clear. Clarity also includes repetition. So it might not it might be that you're communicating a boundary really clearly, but a good, healthy boundary also requires some repetition and consistency so the other person can not just hear it, but experience it. Such an important part of understanding what healthy boundaries are is that it requires integrity. So I have seen a lot of people attempt to set really clear boundaries, and they'll say, but I said it so clearly, I articulated it so clearly, but I didn't hold true to it very long. It pushed me over about 2 days in, and I don't know why I can't just stick to what I said. And this isn't always why this happens, but a lot of the time this happens because the original boundary was set more to please somebody else, and it wasn't truly it didn't hold a lot of integrity to the person's own beliefs and values, and it wasn't truly in alignment. And when it doesn't feel true to you, it is particularly hard to stand by. So I do want to say in this that you are a particular group of people who are trying to navigate a whole lot of boundaries, with some boundaries being out of your control, where you're actually trying to respect the boundaries other people are setting. And so that does complicate things, particularly if you are not in full alignment or agreement with what those boundaries need to be. That's a hard space to be in. Boundary setting inherently feels hard. So I would say count on it, 99.9% of the time, if you are setting boundaries, it will feel hard. So I guess the good news is that it's clear when you're doing it right, it's going to feel hard. So just to talk a bit about the alternative to resentment. I always find it hard when we say what not to do, but we don't replace it with what to do. And so I was thinking about, the dangers of resentment and enmeshment, and how easily we can get in that danger zone in relationships, and the damage and the erosion that happens in our relationships when those things creep in. And I thought, okay, that's what we don't want, but what do we want? And I think the antidote here is empathy. The trick around enmeshment, really, enmeshment is a psychological term that we use in relationship to describe when we've really fused ourselves with somebody, when we don't know where we begin and the other person ends. And so we end up feeling like we have to take on other people's problems. We own what belongs to somebody else. We do a whole lot of fixing on their behalf. Fixing is different than coming alongside and helping. And so we want to be careful about that. And I think empathy is, it might seem simple, but it is incredibly powerful as an antidote to enmeshment, because it entails holding a differentiation between who you are and who another person is. And at the same time, you have the opportunity to feel their pain, be with them in their pain, endure the struggle alongside them, but not take it on as though you were taking the backpack off them and putting it on you. Practicing empathy sounds a lot like healthy boundaries. It sounds a lot like, I see you, I hear you, this is incredibly painful, I feel for you, this is hard, you're not alone, I am with you. It does not sound like, let me take that from you, let me fix this for you, let me make the pain go away. The other component of really understanding what a boundary is that it requires zero justification or apology. So often we start a boundary with, I'm sorry, but. And as soon as we set the tone for that, it's as though, I get the sentiment. The sentiment is to say, I wish this wasn't required. But healthy boundaries are a gift. We don't need to be apologizing for them. And in a lot of scenarios, particularly when we are setting boundaries with children, information and facts is okay. But when we get into a long dialogue about rationalizing with them about why a boundary needs to be there, it can confuse a child. It can make it look as though it's negotiable. You are not owing anybody a sorry about setting a line for yourself, and you are not owing anybody full justification for why that boundary is there. You are okay to set the boundary that is needed for you. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what it looks like to set and maintain boundaries. First of all, it's going back to that early component of what a healthy boundary requires, is really understanding your own boundaries. You cannot communicate, hold, or maintain any boundary if you are not really clear about it yourself. You have to know what it means to say no. You have to give yourself permission to be able to do that. You have to be able to advocate for yourself and hold true to consequences. And this is not about punishment. This is about maintenance. So repeating your boundaries is going to be really important. So knowing your boundaries, being clear about them yourself, not going into conversation with somebody about setting a boundary without really having a clear idea of what that really means at the ground level for you. And when you're working in positions the way you are, where you are fostering the growth of children in your care who also belong in part to other people, you are coming from a very shared space, but not always a shared perspective. And so advocating wherever possible to hold and articulate boundaries amongst the other people in your world and on that team and in your family is really helpful. It's not to say that everybody will agree, but it is so important to be able to strive to have boundaries that can be compatible. And in doing so, it offers the kids and yourself and your adult children and any other caregivers, respite caregivers involved, your friends who are trying to support you, other family members, and social workers, resource workers, the whole system. It gives people clarity about being able to say, we can work collaboratively and we can work together. If you are so busy trying to negotiate differences in boundaries, it leaves everyone in that circle and in that network feeling frustrated and confused. Naming common goals can be really important. So when you go into boundary setting, try and think about naming the intention. This is not justification, but it's looking for shared meaning. What are we on the same page about? So if I'd like to set a really concrete boundary with somebody, I'd like to introduce the need for that boundary with the person by saying something like, I'm noticing that this doesn't look like it's working for you. And I really don't feel like it's working for me either. I think we're on the same page about that. Setting the tone like that creates an us and a we instead of me against you. And it leaves people much more receptive to listening to, how do we engage together in problem solving? How do we both contribute to setting a healthy boundary here that's going to meet both our needs? You cannot collaboratively problem solve if you don't see yourselves as a team. Any opportunity you have to acknowledge differences is healthy. So it's not avoiding. This is not rose-colored glasses. We're not going into this saying we're only going to acknowledge we're on the same page, but it's also saying, I also think we come from some different perspectives. And it's not to say I'm right and you're wrong, but we have different needs here. So can we sit down and talk about what those different needs are. What does that mean for you, and how do I honor, in setting my own boundaries for what I need, what can I do to honor your boundaries for what you need? Communicating really proactively. So I see this a lot, that it's really uncomfortable to have these hard conversations, especially if we don't feel clear internally about what we're asking for. And so we avoid them, but sometimes problems beat us to the punch. And boundaries are crossed before that we've had a chance to dialogue about them. And we feel it in our gut, right? You know when it doesn't sit right with you. If we have not proactively communicated, it is really hard for people to be respectful of those boundaries. And it's such a difficult experience to enter conflict management at that point, where you are now embroiled in something that you wish could have been avoided. If you can name and articulate and have the courage to proactively do that and not try and wait till a problem arises, it goes much better typically. It's also lovely to be able to say, I'm really interested in our relationship, in feeling like I respect you and you respect me, because I think we can work way better together if we can do that. Here are the things that I need in order to feel like my boundaries are being respected. So name what it would look like if it went well. Also, we could talk a bit about just recognizing what's in your control and what isn't. And I think this is important for boundary setting, that you are only capable of controlling what is within you. And so naming what you need from other people is a fair thing to express, but boundaries are about what you hold true to for yourself. It's not about ensuring somebody else does their job. So you requiring somebody else to change in order for you to be okay is a different type of boundary. And so we have to recognize what's in our control to change. And remember that when we are being really clear about what we need and what we don't need. Being consistent and following through is what I was referring to in the last slide about repetition, that our consistency offers people the gift of experiencing a boundary. Now, it might not feel like a gift because they might be receiving it like that quote that I shared earlier. They might feel it as hurt, rejection, or abandonment. Again, this is where your boundaries need to be clear, because that is not your problem to own. You can have compassion and empathy and hold space for that person to feel that sense of loss and panic, but it is not yours to fix by saying, okay, forget about it. We don't erase our boundaries to make somebody feel okay. We hold our boundaries and offer empathy. You genuinely care for how that impacts the person. That is not in question. It is about how you are going to stay in the game. And for you to be able to stay in the role that you do, you need to have those healthy boundaries. And I would add that it's not just a gift in that sense, but it's also a gift because it's modeling something that many adults don't yet even have. You sharing and showing and demonstrating really healthy boundaries models what it looks like to do it for themselves. So before we talk a little bit about what this looks like for you, and we can dialogue a bit about asking some central questions about how this is relevant for you, I want to talk about that self-care piece and about managing your own stress. I would be shocked if any one of you could say, I am not in a stressful position. I've yet to meet somebody. So if you find somebody who can say that, please send them my way. I will suspiciously have a conversation with them. In the meantime, let's assume you live in a very high stress intersection. And I am, of course, unsure of where you're at personally, but as we age, and I'm feeling it myself, I'm not what I was 20 years ago. Stress affects me differently. Physiologically, I feel it differently in my bones than I did when I felt maybe more resilient physically about 20 years ago. So I know that that is a thing, and so we should name it and acknowledge it, because if we don't do that for ourselves, we also can't take care of ourselves. So be realistic with what your capacity is. That's a really important aspect of taking care of you. I also want to acknowledge that in taking care of yourself, you know that old adage of the airplane analogy of, if you're in a crashing situation and the plane's going down and you're parenting and you've got a child next to you, put the air mask on for yourself. The oxygen mask needs to be on your face before you attempt to put it on somebody else's. I didn't really soak that analogy in much over the years. I kind of thought that was overused, and yet I'm in a position now where I have had enough lived experience of high stress and in a parenting role where I think, okay, I get why I can't really be there for them if I haven't taken care of myself. And usually, in many cases, it takes parents' depletion to the level of full burnout to be able to recognize the importance of doing this. And I hope that by recognizing that this is something we all can experience and are all at risk of, it prevents some of you from maybe waiting until you are flat on your face before you pick yourself up. So let's talk a bit about what you need to know in order to do your role well. Boundaries is one component of it. Routine, personal self-care is another. So how do you scaffold your own structure of care in a way that matters to you? So somebody, when I was at the thick of my parenting, I have two kids, one with particular special needs who stresses me out quite quickly. In that lived experience, I was witnessed by other people. I had lots of people in my circle who would say to me, oh, you need a break. You need to go to the spa for 3 days. And I used to think, well, great. Are you taking my kids while I go to the spa for 3 days? Like, well, that is not realistic. Thank you for seeing me, but that is not a good suggestion. That's not at all. In fact, it actually stings quite a bit because you've just pointed out what I can't have and I so desperately need. So I just imagine us in this high stress parenting role, and we're doing our very best to manage it. And the best of times we might feel like we're on a donkey on the edge there. And self-care cannot be 3 days at the spa. So personalizing a self-care plan, and actually I would really encourage you to carve out an hour of time, which is self-care, just to make a self-care plan. You need to know your body and to know what works and what does not work for you. It also means that you need to know what's realistic in your world. So don't set yourself up for failure. Do not invite yourself to fantasize about things that are not realistic in your realm. Also, don't give up then. Don't say to yourself, well, I can't have that, so I guess I just have to slug through. You don't have to. You need to come up with a self-care plan that is what I call micro-care, which is moment to moment, small doses of self-care peppered throughout your day, your week, your month, and your year. It is acknowledging that you're worthy of care. It's required of you to care for others well, that unless you have some kind of superhuman cape tucked in your shirt, you are not exceptional in that sense. We all require ourselves to replenish and refuel in order to give. So when you think about the amount you give, and if you were to chart that on a graph, that bar would be exceptionally high. Your output of care is incredibly high. And this is not just when you are face to face with a child, caring for them. It is when you have them on your mind, when you are problem solving, when you are navigating your home and structuring it in a way that is warm and receptive to a child. All of that is a mental load that you carry every second of every day. And in fact, you probably dream about it. So if you think about charting that, and then you chart beside it, you put a bar beside that in your graph of how much do you refuel? How much time in your day are you spending pouring back in? And I would argue that sometimes we are experts at rejecting self-care. It's not just not having it, but when it is there and available, we push it away and we quickly replace it with giving. I want to honor how beautiful the giver is in you, because it is creating an immense insulatory layer for the kids that you care for. It is so important, and what you're doing for them is incredible. And I want you to be able to do that well. And I want you to feel like you aren't gone as a result, that you are no longer you. So self-care is about that. It's about holding and maintaining your own identity, your own interests, your own care, your own refueling and recharging station. So what is that going to look like for you? And maybe we can talk a bit about how you go about figuring that out in our discussion. If you find yourself in a headspace where you are reactive much of the time, I get it. Kids who have a history of trauma, attachment disruption, high stress in change and shifting things, and if they come predisposed to things like anxiety or mood disorders, you are trying to care for someone who is very easily triggered. And in that, you're going to find yourself wanting to react or respond in the moment. And that has a very contagious impact. So if you find yourself irritable, teary, or numb, this is likely in reaction to a sense of way too much output and not enough input. So paying attention to your own body, your physical cues, knowing when your heart is racing way too often, when your blood pressure goes up, when you're having more headaches than usual, those are all signs that your output is higher than your input. If you're in that space currently, it's all fine and well to say, sit down and make a care plan for yourself, but you also need to do some detoxing. So I'll tell you just a little bit about what happens in the body and in the brain when you live under chronic stress. You have chemicals and hormones that fire at high rates in the brain and in your nervous system. And when those are released, they require physical movement to let them flow through your body. So I would think about yourself as a vessel with a cork lid on it. And if you are under enduring stress, that bottle is fueling up with gas. It's filling. The pressure from that's going to pop that cork. You require physiologically to let that move through you at a steady pace so that you are not letting that become toxic inside of you. So movement is huge. Paying attention to your breath is huge. So when you think about sitting down and making your own self-care plan, something you can consider is your breath. Might seem so basic that you don't even pay attention to it, but it regulates all sorts of basic physiological functions inside of you. So if you can commit 3 times a day to 2 minutes of deep, focused breathing, where you put your hand on your belly and on your chest, and you let that air enter deeply, and you let it out through your nose slowly, that regulates and tells your brain, it sends messages from your lungs to your brain that you're safe. which means the hypervigilance and the stress has an opportunity to come down and settle. So what's lovely about this system in your body is it's called the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve runs from your digestive tract up to your brain and branches to your heart. And those vital aspects of you speak in it's bi-directional, so it speaks in both directions. Your brain and your thoughts and your stress in your mind send signals to your stomach, to your heart, and to your nervous system that you are not okay. And it then puts you in fight, flight, hypervigilance mode. We're ready to go, which makes us more reactive, more impatient, more frustrated, more depleted, more numb. And we do that very naturally to cope with high stress. But because it's bi-directional, it means that we can also send signals from our other vital organs up to our brain to say, it's okay, chill out, we're okay right now. What self-care offers you when you do things like deep breathing, drinking enough water, eating regularly and in a healthy way, is your digestive system goes, well, we're all right. It sends the message up to the brain. It's not that bad. We're okay. We can do this. When your heart rate through your breathing is regulated and your blood pressure can lower, those physiological symptoms, those measurements, send signals back to the brain, to the amygdala, that things are okay. If our heart rate is normal, that means we're not in fight flight mode. Okay, I think that the thoughts are probably about the future, about the past. It's not about this moment. I'm not in danger right now, and we can settle down. Sometimes it's going to be important when we kind of merge this with our talk about boundaries, is that you need to intentionally revisit what your boundaries are. I think with some insight and some newfound knowledge and some changing circumstances, it's unfair to expect one boundary to last a lifetime. They need to shift and be flexible. So give yourself some permission, but also don't wait until it's needed. Make a plan to revisit and just pause to ask yourself, is this an effective boundary for now, for what's happening in the present? Or am I fighting against something to hold on tight to a boundary that no longer feels that sense of integrity? It no longer aligns with my needs. So I'd invite you to make that as part of managing stress, is revisiting what your boundaries look like. So I'm going to exit. I'm going to stop sharing here. And I would like to invite you to just, if you're willing, name something that resonated with you or stood out to you in any of the topics that we covered, either around boundaries or self-care. I'd just like to get a pulse on what feels relevant, what feels kind of in your realm today. And just to remember to unmute yourself if